Everyone, this is Kabane the Christian, and today I want to start a series of videos going through a slideshow that I've created talking about the role that the Jewish people played and continue to play in the economy of God, and what relation the Jewish people have with the covenant that God made with Abraham, what relationship the Jewish people have with the church, which, as Paul teaches us, is the children of Abraham according to the Spirit, what relationship the Jewish people have in the overall divine program of redemption, whether there are any promises that are left for them, or whether Israel is simply and irreducibly only what we call the church, or the Jew plus Gentile people of God, joined to the covenant through Jesus the Messiah. Is that the whole story? Now, those who have followed me for a while know that my older view, which I articulated in many places, was that after AD 70, what we call the Jewish people now is simply another nation. That's James Jordan's view, that's Peter Leithart's view. Just another nation. They don't have any covenant significance. The church is the people of God. It's the heir of all the promises, and that's the end of the story. I have shifted away from that view. In saying that I shifted away from that view, I don't renounce everything that I said exegetically in support of it. So, for example, I'm still convinced that the Israel of Romans 11:26 is a reference to the entirety of humanity as it is joined to Christ. But I think that the reason that it bears the name of Israel is irrevocably and inextricably connected with the people of Israel according to the flesh. In other words, the Jewish nation. And I want to emphasize here that when I speak of the Jewish nation, or according to the flesh, I am not speaking of a purely biological purely biological entity. In other words, yes, of course I recognize, as is everyone, that converts to Judaism have played a role in the bloodlines. Okay, not every bloodline goes back to ancient Israel. And it doesn't really matter because national identities are socially constructed. Now, you might hear me say that and think it sounds postmodern, but I want to clarify what I mean by that. God has constituted the world through his logos. In other words, everything that exists in the mind of God because he has constituted it through the ideas which are present perfectly in his mind. God has no subconscious. God knows himself perfectly. So imagine that the reason when we go into our dreams that it's so unstable, and even when we become aware that we're dreaming, we can't really control it very well without practice, is because we've got this deep subconscious. We don't know ourselves very well. But if we comprehensively knew ourselves, and there was nothing that was, separated from our explicit knowledge, well, then we would be able to control it perfectly. There's nothing to draw from except the mind of God. God is infinite. God is infinitely perfect. He has all perfections. He has all glories. Everything that could exist, every perfection that can exist, exists perfectly in his mind. So he creates the world through his mind. And he creates the human family as his image, and he partners with humanity freely in constituting the world. And so mankind participates in his ongoing sustenance of the world in his consciousness, in his will. And God uses man as an instrument to continue to create and to uphold the world. In both Jewish and Christian tradition, we repeatedly hear about specific saints, or in Judaism, tzaddikim, on whose account the world is continuing to exist. In other words, if it weren't for these people who are so closely joined with God, the world would simply dissolve, because God constitutes everything in virtue of his own perfection. He shares himself freely in constituting the creation, but he partners with man in constituting the creation. And so he chooses to continue to uphold and sustain the world and grant it mercy through the free participation of righteous human beings. And so what this means is that the word socially constructed, or the phrase socially constructed, does not mean unreal. National identities are socially constructed, but that doesn't mean they're not real. They are their social construction is an intrinsic quality of their reality. So think about being born into a particular people, a particular nation. You may well be adopted into a particular household, but that doesn't make that nation any less your nation. It's the nation in which you're raised. It's the nation where you grow up. It's the nation in which your kinship relations are constituted. Your bonds of loyalty are born in view of your unique mode of interactions with that nation. You call it your own. Now, the nation of Israel is a specific nation in this sense. So the Jewish people are a nation. This is clear in Genesis 12 and onwards. Exodus 19, called a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And the church is a commonwealth of nations that is enrolled in Zion as citizens. We're going to talk about that as we go forward. And the language of nationhood is only ever used of the church to signify its participation in that original Abrahamic promise. Contrary to certain people who want to eradicate any sense of national loyalty or patriotism, the church is not a nation in the strict sense. It is a family of nations bound in communion with Jesus Christ, the head of the Israelite nation. And so what this means is that conversion doesn't actually affect the continuing identifiability of the Jewish people. If you convert to Judaism throughout the past 2,000 years, today it's a little more complicated because you have all these sects of Judaism, but as a convert, you were assimilated into the nation, and that became your home, that became your culture, it became your people. This happens in biblical times as well. Ruth doesn't just convert to worship the God of Israel. She actually ceases to be a Moabite. She joins the people of Israel as a member of that particular family. Same thing happens with Rahab. Rahab was a born Canaanite, but she joins the people of Israel. She calls that nation her own. Whereas there are other people in the Hebrew Bible who are righteous Gentiles who don't call Israel their nation, but they worship the God of Israel. Hiram of Tyre, for example, is a righteous Gentile king. According to the prophet, I believe it's the prophet Amos, he had a covenant of brotherhood with King David and King Solomon. Yet he did not cease to be a member of the particular nation in which he was born, raised up, and over whom he was the head. So I just want to say that in case anybody wants to say anything about, oh, well, you can't identify the Jewish people anymore because all these converts or whatever. I don't care what proportion of converts you think join the Jewish people and represent their genetic heritage today. The point is, it is still identifiable as a nation because the corporate entity of the Jewish people has continued to identifiably exist throughout the generations. And that's what makes it a particular people. And so I'm going to explain as we work through this why I shifted my view and why I do think that the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and ultimately at Sinai, has enduring significance for the people of Israel according to the flesh. Before I get into the details of this, let's just briefly review some principles in addressing Israel, Jews, and Judaism. These are more spiritual principles. When Jesus approaches the city of Jerusalem, Luke 19, he knows it's going to be judged. He says, "You have rejected the way of peace." And what's his reaction? Does he say, "Good riddance, God is so sick of you"? Does he say, "I'm now going to the Gentiles because I can't deal with you people anymore"? Does he invite the Gentiles to dance and rejoice over the fall of Jerusalem? No, he does not. He weeps over it. The Lord himself weeps. This is the everlasting God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob crying. I believe this is the only other instance other than Lazarus' death where Jesus actually weeps. Now, in a sense, we do rejoice, but we only rejoice over the downfall of the particular wicked people within the nation that God executed judgment against. We do not weep, or we do not rejoice over the enduring. We don't rejoice or boast against the Jewish people corporately. what that means, of course, is subtle and complicated, and we'll work through it. Acts 3:17 to 18. This is a very important point. And now, brothers, this is Peter speaking, and he's talking to the Jewish nation. And now, brothers, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did your rulers. But what God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, that his Messiah would suffer, he thus fulfilled. So Peter doesn't just say, you sinned by crucifying the Lord, but God offers you forgiveness. He doesn't just say that. He actually says that you are less culpable than you would otherwise be because you acted in ignorance. He is, in some ways, in the technical sense of this word, making an excuse or a defense. He is saying Israel is not fully culpable for this sin. Israel did not know that she was crucifying the Messiah. Israel did not know that Jesus was the everlasting Word of God. So Israel is not judged as harshly. Even Paul says, with reference to his past life as a persecutor of Christians, God showed me mercy because I acted in ignorance. In other words, Paul sincerely did want to follow the Word of God. And thus, because of his sincerity in wanting to follow the Word of God, he was of the proper disposition to actually embrace the gospel when it was revealed to him that it was true. This is not true for everybody. Some people, if they learn, you hear a lot of time online, these atheists will say, why doesn't God appear to me? Why doesn't Jesus appear to me? And then in another context, you talk to them, well, what would you say if you died and you met God? I would spit in his face. Well, there you go. There's your answer of why God doesn't appear to you. It would be spiritually damaging, because learning that God is real and spitting in his face is much worse than not knowing that he's real and spitting in the face of someone who you don't think exists. So Paul also says in Romans 10, and he's speaking in a kind of juridical forensic context, I bear them witness. He's a witness for the defense, as it were, that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. It's a real zeal, and it is really God for whom they are zealous, but it is not according to knowledge. There is a partial hardening. And I think Mark Kinzer is probably right in saying that the partial hardening doesn't just refer to part of Israel has not embraced Jesus. I think the Israel which has not corporately embraced Jesus has only been partially hardened. In other words, there is an ongoing zeal for God, even though it is not according to full knowledge. And what's going on in the book of Acts, we read at the end of Acts, Paul offers the gospel to the Jewish nation again, and some embrace it, but then Paul says, you've hardened your hearts. He quotes Isaiah 6. He says, I'm going to the Gentiles. Well, some embraced it. Why did he say that? Because the gospel was being offered corporately to the Israelite nation as it was represented by Israel's rulers. And what was being asked for was that kind of collective, formal embrace of Jesus as Messiah. So even though certain persons within Israel, even many people within Israel embraced Jesus as Messiah, because there wasn't a national reception of him as Messiah, it was a national rejection of Jesus as the Messiah. But point being, the New Testament goes out of its way again and again and again to defend Israel according to the flesh. Jesus says of those who participated in his crucifixion, he says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. That is ratified again by Peter, it's ratified by Paul, it's throughout the New Testament. There's really no basis at all for boasting against the branches, as Paul will say in Romans 11, 17 to 18. He's speaking here of the Gentiles and the Israelites according to the flesh. The covenant people is an olive tree. The Gentiles are wild branches. They've been grafted into that olive tree through Jesus the Messiah. They share in its sap or its oil, the Holy Spirit. And they have been grafted in because some have been broken off. And Paul says, don't boast against the branches. Don't boast against those who, according to the flesh, are the people of the covenant, are the Messiah's family, according to the flesh. Don't boast against them. And when he uses this word boast, he is using the same phrase that he used back in Romans 2, when Israel, bearing the Torah, claimed, in the words of Paul's interlocutor, that she was a light of the world, that she was the proper vessel through which God could enlighten the idolatrous nations who've been condemned in Romans 1, because she had the Torah. And Paul says, if you rely on the law and you boast in the Torah, then what about all the people in Israel who rob temples? What about all the people in Israel who violate the Torah? In fact, because of Israel's corporate failure to obey the Torah fully, the name of God is blasphemed among the nations on your account. Israel was meant to be the light of the world, but Paul says, because of Israel's failure to fully embrace that Torah, through which he was to be the light of the world, it actually has furthered the world's darkness in certain respects. So, overall message here, please do not have such a loose tongue that you will go on rants against, quote-unquote, the Jews, that you will be gullible and receive everything that E. Michael Jones has to say to you. Look, he's not right, okay? I know the stuff that he appeals to well enough to know that he is not giving you the full picture, and that being charitable. I'm not going to say more about him than that. But I've seen Orthodox and Catholic, quote-unquote, traditionalists run their mouth and just say, quite honestly, horrible things about Jews and Judaism. And I know for a fact that it is an actual stumbling block for Jews to embrace Christianity or Orthodoxy. I have talked to multiple Jewish people who were very interested in Orthodox Christianity, but were really scared away by this kind of language. Please hold your tongue. If you have any reason to think that you might not fully know what you're talking about, hold your tongue. In this context, Judaism is a complex tradition. It requires more than superficial engagement. You cannot read a passage from Talmud on some website and think that you've gotten the Talmud's view. Remember, the Talmud is an argument. There are many different views that are presented on a single page. Very often the view that's quoted on these anti-Jewish websites, and I'm not using that as a pejorative, I'm just saying websites which critique Jews and Judaism, very often the view that's quoted as the view of Judaism on these websites is the minority view, which is ultimately overruled if you read the whole passage in its context. For example, there is a debate in the Talmud about who is my neighbor. Same thing that Jesus addresses in the Gospels. And there is a view that's expressed there that the neighbor refers only to fellow Jews. But the majority view is actually the opposite. The majority view embraces what Jesus ultimately taught about the identity of the neighbor. Many people will read the New Testament, will read what Jesus has to say about the Jews of his day, and just apply that directly to the post-AD 70 rabbis. But we have to remember, first of all, by far the worst group of Jesus' day were the Sadducees, and God judged them appropriately. They were destroyed completely. Then there were the Pharisees. The Pharisaic tradition basically was the closest identifiable movement within Judaism to what Jesus taught. There were different movements of Pharisees. You have the most problems with those who are closest to you, and so Jesus engages them and debates them in the most detail. Why is it that the Pharisees go and they say, why do your disciples not observe the custom of washing of hands? Well, what that indicates is that Jesus actually did observe the custom of washing of hands. This was a non-biblical Pharisaic tradition which expressed the reality that Israel corporately was the place where the Spirit of God was blowing, because according to Ezekiel, the Spirit of God left the temple and he went to dwell with the exiles. That's basically what it's symbolically expressing. Well, Jesus was observing this custom, otherwise they would have said, why don't you observe the custom of washing of the hands? If you look at what Judaism looks like after AD 70, there's actually a passage in the Talmud which talks about 7 different kinds of Pharisees, and it calls 6 of those kinds of Pharisees a plague. It speaks of the plague of the Pharisees. And what are the criticisms that it raises against these Pharisees? Well, the criticisms are things like they are obsessed with outward forms. They observe the will of God only to be seen by others. They're not really devoted in their heart to God. In other words, many of the same things that Jesus says. Now, of course, the picture is more complex than that totally positive picture, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of how complex the tradition really is. One final example, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Many people will quote passages, especially from Jewish mystical literature, which sound very, to use a not entirely appropriate term, very racist. I like to say racialist because I think racialist is a more precise term. It means that different, quote-unquote, races, different people groups are ontologically different from each other in a way that that bridge cannot be gapped, that gap cannot be bridged. And you can quote Jewish texts like the Tanya, which seems to speak in very shocking ways about Gentiles. But actually, you have to read these texts in their context, and you also have to read it in the context of the terminological tradition within which the authors of these texts are operating. If you read some of the most extreme passages in the Tanya, you'll find actually it explicitly makes an exception for those Gentiles who are not idolaters, and it's actually drawing on biblical language of becoming like what you worship. So if you worship something which is not alive, which is deaf and dumb, if you worship beasts, well, then you become like them. You reduce the quality and the standing of your soul. Now, there are some representatives within the Jewish tradition who have taken it in very extreme and somewhat horrifying ways, but in fact they are, in general, the fringe of the Jewish tradition. Another example of this, if you look at some of the things that are said within the Chabad-Lubavitch movement, you can find statements within the history of Chabad which sound very, very, very anti-Gentile in such a way that it would imply that Gentiles are somehow ontologically a different kind of being than Jews. But if you actually read it in the light of the whole Lubavitch tradition, well, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menahem Mendel Schneerson, speaks about how this distinction and this superiority of Israel over the nations is inverted in the world to come, such that the nations of the world come to share in Israel's unique holiness and unique calling, such that Israel was only created for the sake of the nations. And you can find videos of him actually rebuking other Jewish figures who spoke too harshly about the nations, and he said, no, our whole mission is for the nations. We're meant to pray for the nations. If there's a bigger picture than that, you can find stuff that's pretty bad, but it's not the whole story. So unless you're really familiar with this whole tradition, hold your tongue, because it's a complex tradition, and you have to treat these texts the way that you would want them to treat our New Testament and our church fathers. You cannot expect any Jew to respond to calls of, well, you have to read these patristic, anti-Judaic passages in their context. You have to realize there was a specific rhetorical style. If you want that to be taken seriously, you have to extend the same charity to those Jews with their texts. Anyway, moving on. What's the big theological question? What's at stake, in other words? What are we asking here, and why does it matter? So, the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, they were given to bear witness to God, who makes himself known to the whole world and to the nations of the world as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as the God of Israel. From Genesis 1 onwards, God has a plan for the entirety of mankind. God creates the world in 6 days. First, he creates the heavens and the earth, and it's only the earth which is without form, void, and dark. And through the 6 days, he is going to shape and mold the earth to become more and more like its heavenly model. He will fill it, he will form it, and he will make it brighter. He will create a stellar heavens with stars in it as an image, as an expression and symbol of the heaven he created on the first day with all of the heavenly hosts and angels. That's why in the Bible there's the earth, then there's the heavens, and then there's the heaven of heavens. There are these two different kinds of heaven according to the scriptures. And he shapes it, and he forms it, and he brightens it. And then on the 6th day, he makes man as his image. And the man whom he makes as his image is not individual human beings. The image is the human family, corporately, collectively. That's why in Genesis 5, 1-2, we hear God made male and female in his image, and he called them man. It is a corporate reality. That is the image bearer in the world. It is man in his unity and in his communion that reflects God, because God is one and God is three. He's equally one and three. In fact, the oneness of God is fulfilled in his threeness, and the threeness of God is fulfilled in his oneness. These two things are perfectly balanced, and that's why he says, let us make man in our image. The whole reason there's a divine council, and this is indeed divine council terminology, first person plural is classic divine council terminology, as in Isaiah 6, but the whole reason there's a divine council, the whole reason God works this way, is because there's this pre-eternal council of Father, Son, and Spirit, and that's why you find in these very same contexts, God will say in his heart, or he will say to himself. It is not only divine council terminology, the very significance of divine council terminology is to be found within God in Trinity. But he says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And what do you find? Male and female. There is a plural unity. Go forward in the Bible, Genesis chapter 11. You've got the judgment on Tower of Babel. God says, let us go down. He is again addressing his council. He's also speaking to himself. This is a Trinitarian context as well as a divine council context, and these two actually are very tightly woven together. Well, what happens? It's a judgment. Yes, God scatters them to the ends of the earth, but it's also a creative event. God is moving man further to its ultimate eschatological destiny. How? Because he now makes one human family into 70 different nations. And then in Genesis 12, you find the central thread of the divine plan, the instrument through which he is going to realize the purpose for the whole of mankind. Because man is to take dominion, right? Man is to subdue the earth. Man is to participate in God's work of bringing the creation from its Sabbath to its great Sabbath, from the seventh day to the eighth day. Man is going to be a co-creator with God. We see Adam doing that in Genesis chapter 2. Adam is naming things. This is something that God does in Genesis 1. Man goes astray. There's a false start, but God is still committed not only to bring redemption to the world, but also to complete that original purpose. So the main plot, in other words, is the glorification of the world through the human family, and the major subplot, which needs to be resolved in order to get to the end of the main plot, is the salvation of the human family. And keep in mind, we're not just talking about the salvation of individual human beings, but mankind has to be rectified. Mankind, corporately, has to be fixed in order that this original project can go forward. And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 12. So just as we saw in Genesis 11 that God moves his creation further to its eschatological destiny in the very act of judgment, so also God moves the human family towards its eschatological fulfillment in the very act of calling Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to be the instrument of healing to the nations of the world. So God says to Abraham, I will bless you. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. And in you will all the families of the earth be blessed. And then Abraham builds an altar. Well, this language was last used in Genesis chapter 8, when Noah comes out of the ark, and then all of the animals come out of the ark by families, and then we're told God blessed them, and Noah builds an altar. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are building an ark, as it were, and the nations of the world are signified by the various kinds of animals who are brought into the ark of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in Genesis, this is fulfilled at the end of the book, when a famine comes across the whole face of the world. That phrase, across the whole face of the world, it was last used for the flood. Just as Noah brings all the seed into the ark, well, Joseph brings all the seed into Egypt. But unlike Noah, where he only saves a remnant, a tiny remnant, only 7 other people are saved in the days of Noah, Joseph brings all the nations of the world to Egypt and feeds them with bread and wine. So the first judgment by water, the flood, the last judgment by fire, the famine. This is a major kind of dichotomy in the Bible, and that's a foreshadowing of the ultimate structure of the divine plan. So God has said, I'm going to bring redemption to the nations of the world, and I'm going to bring it through the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The prophets of Israel all bear witness that in the Messianic age, God is going to illumine the nation. Isaiah 11, a branch from his roots, that is the root of Jesse, the father of David, will bear fruit. And this is the day when the nations will inquire of the God of Israel. Isaiah 27, the same language. Jacob shall take root, Israel shall put forth shoots and blossom, and fill the whole world with fruit. The nations of the world will hear about the word of God. Jeremiah 3, all the nations of the world will be gathered to Jerusalem and worship God with one voice. Isaiah 65 to 66, a river will go out from Jerusalem, illumine and give life to the nations, and carry them back to worship God. Zechariah 14, a great feast of tabernacles, where 70 bulls are offered for the 70 nations of the world. Great feast of tabernacles, at which all the nations will be gathered to worship the God of Israel. The main thread of Torah, prophets, and writings is about the blessing of the whole world through Israel. God reveals himself to the nations as their God, without thereby casting off his identity as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what's the prima facie case for holding Jesus to be the Messiah in whose day the prophets say the nations will be illumined? Well, just look at where the world was in 50 BC. Who worshipped the God of Abraham as the God of Abraham in 50 BC? Well, you did have God-fearing Gentiles at the synagogues. The Romans and the Greeks, they knew who Abraham's God was. It was the weird God of the Jews. But they didn't worship this God in general, other than a few exceptions. So, look at the world then, and look at the world now. Everywhere in the world, everybody now knows who the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is. Half the world at least professes to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so if we just brought a person who didn't know anything about history, didn't know anything about religion except the basic story of the Tanakh, and we said, okay, compare where the God of Abraham was in 50 BC to today, it would look like the Messianic program has really started going in force. When was the turning point? Well, the turning point really seems to be the life of a particular Jewish man, Yeshua bar Yosef, of this little town of Nazareth. Jesus, the son of Joseph. That phrase, son of Joseph, is a very interesting one because of the traditions of the Messiah ben Joseph. It seems that this Jewish man is the fulcrum around which the history of the world swings. It seems that his life is the instrument where history turns and turns its fundamental corner. 3 centuries later, the emperor of the Romans ends sacrifice and professes that there is one supreme God, that's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the one who revealed himself at Mount Sinai. And he worships him in the name of this Jew, Jesus of Nazareth. So, we look at Jesus' life. Hey, looks like he claimed to be the Messiah of Israel, and it looks like he's really done something which the Messiah is supposed to do, that is, illumine the nations of the world, to bring them to the worship of God. As Jewish counter-missionaries often say, look at your window. Around every Passover season, you got thousands of Gentiles actually making a physical pilgrimage to Jerusalem to worship God because of what they believe he has done in the life of a particular Jew whom they identify as Messiah. That's the prima facie case. And yet, the very people to whom these promises were initially made, this nation, which is Israel, from which God derives his identity as the God of Israel, the nation which gave us the patriarchs and the prophets, gave us the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible and Torah, prophets, writings, and in fact has preserved it in its original language, they have corporately rejected the claims of Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph, to be the Jewish Messiah. So what gives? If he's the Messiah, to whom are these promises made? We read throughout the Bible, the promises of illumining the nations are linked consistently with the redemption of the people of Israel. Well, how exactly do these things come together? How does any of this make sense? Is there any way of making sense of the fact that you have billions of Gentiles worshiping the God of Abraham in the name of someone who they say is the Messiah, while the people of Abraham, the descendants of Abraham according to the flesh, say he's not the Messiah? How do we make sense of this? And if we're so used to the situation, we don't really perceive its strangeness. But it is very odd. I mean, Paul consistently uses the word mystery about the relationship of Jew and Gentile in Christ, about the ultimate redemptive program. Paul says this is a mystery when he says all Israel will be saved. So, I'll close with this slide, and then we'll work on presenting my own view in the next few videos. The theological landscape in terms of relating Israel and the church. And by Israel here, I mean, of course, the Jewish people in Israel according to the flesh. So the dispensational view has been overwhelmingly the loudest in terms of a Christian group, a Christian tradition, which sees inherent significance in the Jewish people. A Christian group which looks at the state of Israel and says, this is very significant in God's program. So the dispensational view, over the past few centuries, they kind of brought the question to the fore of Christian theology. And the dispensational view is really not sufficient. And in fact, we'll talk about this more in the next few videos. Most Messianic Jewish theologians recognize that it's just not sufficient. It does not do justice to the New Testament. Okay, the New Testament refers to the Gentiles who are united to Christ as the descendants of Abraham. It refers to the church as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You have all of this language which is used for the people of Israel in the Hebrew Bible being applied to the church in the New Testament. But the dispensational view explains this simply by saying, well, it's because there's one God who makes both covenants. So it's very similar. He makes the same kind of covenants with both groups of people because, well, he's the same God. He acts in similar ways. And the overlap between Israel and the church, that is, a Jewish person who is joined to Christ, well, the overlap is great, fine. He's a member of the nation of Israel, and he's a member of the church, but it's not structurally important for the identity of either Israel or the church. So, and this is why you have something like a pre-tribulation rapture. The whole point of the pre-tribulation rapture is that it gets the church off the scene so that God can do what he's going to do with Israel. And actually, in the Left Behind books, there's a conversation between two of the characters where one of them says, in fact, it's kind of interesting to think, we're not the church, we are the tribulation saints. Because the idea is, after the rapture, there is no more church. The church has been taken off the scene. And so during this parenthetical period, is the technical term for it, during this parenthetical period which the prophets did not anticipate, and this is based on a misreading of Ephesians and its use of the language of mystery, during this parenthetical period, God is dealing with the church, which is the body of Christ, which is this new corporate entity which the Old Testament never saw coming. And Israel is its own thing. There's the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, and God's going to deal with them after he gets the church off the scene. Okay, so this is a really crude view. It doesn't do justice to the New Testament. It doesn't make any sense out of the Old Testament. It doesn't explain why anybody should believe that Jesus is the Messiah, because the Messiah's mission at every point of the road is all about Israel. It's centered on Israel. The Messiah's redemptive purpose is carried out through his accomplishment in, through, and for Israel. The nations are only redeemed through Israel. This is a major point that Paul makes in Romans 10 to 11. Paul will say, well, the nations believe, so how is this the case? If Israel has not believed, how is it the nations have believed? You can't believe without someone hearing, and they can't hear without someone being sent. So who was sent? And Paul's answer is the remnant of Israel. These emissaries in Isaiah 17 to 19. After God has reduced the olive tree to a remnant, that remnant is sent as emissaries to the nations. And that work of being sent as emissaries to the nations sanctifies and heals the nations so that ultimately the nations are the instrument for Israel's regathering. We'll talk about this more in a bit. So that's dispensational view. It probably is the most visible theological view. Among kind of low church evangelicals, it's fairly popular for those who would put forth some kind of theological system. The next one is, and I'm grouping a lot of subtopics into this one, is the New Christian Zionism. So the New Christian Zionism is the phrase that you would use to describe this movement within the churches, and then Messianic Judaism. So Messianic Judaism is basically the phrase that I'm using to describe those who hold this view, who are identifying as Jews and are congregating in Messianic Jewish synagogues. So it's important to say when I talk about Messianic Judaism, I am not talking about Jews for Jesus. And in fact, if you look at the history of Messianic Judaism, Jews for Jesus goes back to mission groups to the Jews in the 19th and early 20th century, who identified as Hebrew Christians, Hebrew Christianity. And Messianic Judaism was a term to describe a particular movement that was not Hebrew Christianity. So Messianic Judaism referred to those Jews who wanted to make the people of Israel, the Jewish people, their primary identity, who wanted to keep the Torah and held that to be covenantally significant and not merely pragmatic for missions purposes. And those in Hebrew Christianity felt that that was very problematic. And they said, we are not Messianic Jews, but, and that's where Jews for Jesus comes from, Hebrew Christianity, but the term Messianic Judaism was then appropriated basically by all of Hebrew Christianity in the 60s and 70s. And so now it's very hard to disentangle those. But Jews for Jesus is not Messianic Judaism because they do not preeminently congregate in Messianic Jewish synagogues. They place very, very little emphasis on observance of the Torah, but most importantly, 98% of the reason that I distinguish them so sharply is you go to any Jews for Jesus website, and in fact there are Messianic synagogues which are basically like this. If you look at their quote-unquote confession of faith, it's just an evangelical confession of faith. If you know evangelical confessions of faith, it is exactly like that, except they add one more point saying that Jewish people are irrevocably elected as the people of God and they have as their permanent inheritance the land of Israel. Well, the point is that those who are part of these movements of Jews for Jesus, it's not just that they don't hold X or Y theological view. It's that their fundamental thought world, their framework within which they read the Bible, their theological pattern of thinking is identical to evangelicalism. They're simply not different enough to identify them as anything different than a wing of evangelical Protestantism. Now, Messianic Judaism is embodied by groups like the Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council, by theologians like Mark Kinzer. Mark Kinzer, a very sharp and astute guy. Actually, reading his work was pretty instrumental in my own development, change of my views. And the idea here is that Israel corporately is the people of God, irrevocably elected, and they're a genealogy, they're a nation, they're a particular people bound to God through circumcision and through the covenantal obligation of Sinai. How that cashes out, they differ among themselves. And the church has an Abrahamic identity because they've been linked and woven into the destiny and orbit of Israel through the Jewish Messiah. So the church is the commonwealth of Israel, as Paul will call them in Ephesians 2:12. The church can call the generation at Sinai our fathers. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Gerald McDermott is a representative of New Christian Zionism. And it's called New Christian Zionism because of the distinctive approach to politics in the Middle East that results from this. So there is a real kind of rethinking of what this theological view entails politically in terms of, well, what does it mean to say that God has covenanted with Israel according to the flesh to give them this land forever? It does not necessarily mean that you need to support Benjamin Netanyahu or that the disengagement from Gaza was intrinsically evil. There's a wide variety of views that are compatible with that theological affirmation. But the big thing here theologically is that the relationship between Israel and the church is no longer as distinct as it was in evangelical dispensationalism. There is the very real idea that their destinies have been bound up together, that they are intrinsically linked, that actually the identity of the church is organically dependent on the people of Israel, and actually vice versa. The people of Israel have an organic dependence on the church and a destiny to lay at the center of the church because of the Jewish Messiah, who is objectively the head of the Jewish nation and has the church as his body. So some Catholic theology is very much like this. And then you've got what I call the crude historic and the nuanced historic models. So these terms are not mutually exclusive from each other. I think that you can articulate a view which recognizes the Jewish people as heirs of the everlasting covenant, and you can articulate that view in such a way that it stands in an organic relationship with the historic church, with the historic tradition of the church, which in fact has consistently articulated a vague expectation that the Jewish nation would one day embrace Jesus corporately, though the theological significance of that expectation was, as I said, vague. It wasn't cashed out fully. But the crude historic model is based on a very sharp distinction between two different kinds of blessings. So the church has a spiritual blessing. It has the blessing of eternal salvation. It has the blessing of communion with God. But the Jewish people, carnal Israel, as it would often be called, only had material blessings promised to them under the Old Covenant. And because of their rejection of Jesus, they inherit those material curses rather than blessings. So you not only have the church as blessed, but it's blessed in a different way. They're covenantally bound to Abraham in a fundamentally different way. The Jewish people, it was only because of their carnality that they were promised material blessings at all. I don't think that that is a legitimate or defensible account of the Hebrew Bible. It's very clear that actually the material blessings in the Torah are linked intrinsically and innately with their spiritual mission. And I think that is something which unfolds into the history of the church as well. I've dealt with this in other places on my blog, not really on my YouTube. The reason I call it the crude historic view is because the way that it accounts for the New Testament is kind of simply to say, well, the word Israel is used in different senses in the New Testament. There's no real coherent framework by which these different uses are related to each other. There's no hermeneutical key through which we can make sense of God's prophetic program of redemption as a whole, as we read it in Torah, prophets, writings, New Testament. And there's just generally been this vague expectation of a mass conversion of Jews at the end of the age. But the mass conversion is kind of just part of a checklist of things that must happen before Jesus returns at the end of the age. And actually, just briefly, I think it's related, the language of the return of Jesus, it has some precedent. I don't want to throw it out completely, but I don't think that it's the best language to use because it implies an absence. I think better language is, and a more biblical word to use would be the revelation of Jesus. The final, quote-unquote, return of Jesus, the general resurrection of the dead, is the total revelation of Jesus. Because Jesus is already present and is already reigning actively as Lord of the world and is intimately engaged with the daily affairs of the nations of the world and is always working through the Holy Spirit in a more direct way than he was in the Old Covenant. He's not absent, and he's ascended, and he continues the same mission that he began in his life, death, and resurrection on earth. So there's one coming, one mission that is unfolded through history and revealed in its totality at the end of the world, at the end of the age, when all things will be revealed as a mirror of God. So, I think the language of return is linked with this idea of Israel or the mass conversion of Jews as kind of just an event on a checklist. Because there's not a sense of how this is concretely woven into the overarching story of the redemption of the world. There's not a sense of how Jesus, as King of Israel, and thus as the heir of all nations, there's not a sense of how this is integral to his program of redemption. And then what I would call the nuanced historic. These aren't necessarily sharply different theological views. They're kind of different approaches reflecting different levels of theological competence that have appeared throughout church history. Nuanced historic would generally talk about the church's incorporation into Israel's covenant, the covenant that we read about in the Hebrew Bible. It will generally understand that the blessings and curses that are covenantally bound to Israel are blessings and curses which apply in certain ways to the church as well, and to nations which have been Christianized and thus covenanted with God. People often read, they read church history and they say, well, this has been a good era for Christianity and they weren't obviously blessed. It's a more complicated story than that. But the same is true in the Old Testament. Only a very shallow and naive reading of the Old Testament would conclude that whenever the people are faithful, God will immediately bless them. And whenever they are unfaithful, God will immediately curse them. You have to read the book of Deuteronomy in its entirety, and you have to read it carefully. And you have to read the history of Israel in its entirety and carefully to understand the precise way in which these blessings and curses can be expected to outwork throughout history, and why, in fact, there are blessings and curses promised in the first place. The blessings that are promised in response to faithfulness are not arbitrary blessings. In fact, faithfulness is the pattern of a truly human and fulfilled life, and it will organically generate these blessings because of the way that God has structured the world. He's telling you how to live in a way that is coherent with the way He has structured the world. If you follow that model, you will be blessed. And when you accumulate blessings, you reinvest those blessings to confirm the covenant and to further your obedience, to further the glorification of the world. And that's why it's extended into the era of the church as well. But again, even in the nuanced historic model, the Jewish people are understood to have some expectation of final redemption. They will eventually be baptized. Yet, the exact meaning of that for the whole system of theology, what does that mean for the nature of the covenant and the nature of the church in and of itself, it's not really articulated. It's not that it's been poorly articulated as much as it just often has not been articulated at all. If you want to get a good sense of certain ways in which it was engaged in maybe in the era of Augustine, read this book called Augustine and the Jews. It's very insightful. Augustine was one of the few Christian theologians to reflect on Jews and Judaism in a fully theological way. He's generally understood to be extremely critical of them, but it's a little more. It's a more complicated story than that. It's a very interesting book. I think Paula Fredrickson is the author. So I'm going to cut off here, but just to give you a sense of where I'm going. The way in which the church is joined to Israel, and the way in which the church is Israel, I think can be understood analogously with the way that the church is called Christian. So think about the word Christian. Well, the word Christian is given us as a name because we take the name of Christ. Yet, in being joined to Jesus Christ and having taken on the name of Christian, meaning anointed, we have the Spirit, we're anointed by the same Spirit that anointed him at his baptism, and with which he eternally dwells in love with the Father through the Spirit. That does not supplant the unique applicability of the name Christ to the actual person, Jesus Christ. So we become an heir of that name. That name is inscribed on us, and yet its inscription on us comes because of its being held in itself by Jesus Christ, the divine person who is incarnate in human nature. And I think that the church's identity as Israel is actually to be understood like this. Israel refers to a nation, and the church is not a nation. Church is only called a nation when the phrase is being used symbolically in order to explain how intimately the church is associated with the Abrahamic covenant. But the church is a family of nations. A nation is a people. It has a land. It has a home. It's a kinship structure. The church is not in itself a nation. The church takes up into itself pre-existing national structures. It takes up into itself pre-existing households. So we use household language for the church, but that doesn't mean that when a father, mother, and children convert to Christianity and are baptized, that they're going to all separate from each other. It actually means that Christianity enters into that pre-existing household structure, fulfills it, glorifies it, and ratifies it. So the church is not a nation in the strict sense of that word. Yet God makes his promises to a nation. God says in Jeremiah 31, Israel will never cease to be a nation before me. I think it might actually be Jeremiah 33. There's clearly particular promises and covenants which are made to a nation and a people where this it's very difficult to explain this in a way that is going to make the Jewish nation entirely irrelevant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to leave it off here, and I hope you got something out of this video. I know it might not have been totally coherent because I'm still in many ways working through this. But thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Please keep me in your prayers, and I will talk to you again soon.